Now come to the statement. I call Minister Hamish Falconer.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a statement on Syria. Events in Syria over the past few days are deeply concerning. We're working as quickly as possible to establish from reliable sources of information what exactly happened and who was responsible. But reports that large numbers of civilians have been killed in coastal areas in ongoing violence are horrific. As the Foreign Secretary made clear in his statement yesterday, the interim authorities in Damascus must ensure the protection of all Syrians and set out a clear path to transitional justice. This is a critical moment for Syria, Mr. Speaker, and for the interim authorities to demonstrate their intent to promote stability and to govern in the interest of all Syrians. Since the fall of Assad on the 8th of December, our priority has been to support a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political transition, one that leads to an inclusive, non-sectarian and representative government. We've been clear, anyone seeking a role in governing Syria should demonstrate a commitment to the protection of human rights, unfettered access for humanitarian aid, safe destruction of Assad's chemical weapons stockpiles, and combat terrorism and extremism. This is the only way forward towards a more stable, free and prosperous future for Syria and for Syrians who suffered for so long under the brutal Assad regime. We have consistently emphasised this message in all our diplomatic engagement with the interim authorities and in concert with international partners. We will continue to focus our diplomacy to this end. The UK is engaging privately and regularly with the interim authorities at every level, including through ministers and our Syrian envoy. We support them in taking steps that will deliver a more stable, free and prosperous future for the Syrian people. We welcomed the announcement by interim Syrian President al-Shara on forming an inclusive transitional government leading to free and fair elections. We welcomed the National Dialogue Conference held on the 25th of February. But the violence over the weekend demonstrates that more needs to be done to bring Syria's different groups together, and we urge the interim authorities to urgently establish a clear process and timeline for the next phase of the transition. Representative figures from across Syria need to be appointed to the transitional government and the recently announced Legislative Council. Our overarching objective is to see a stable Syria. In addition to supporting an inclusive political process, we are also focused on preventing escalation of conflict in northern Syria, tackling security threats, including the threat from terrorism, and the destruction of chemical weapons. We are also supporting economic recovery through lifting some sanctions and scaling up humanitarian assistance. The UK, like our partners, imposed sanctions on Assad's regime to hold him and his associates accountable for their oppression of Syria's people. This government has, in recent weeks, made changes to those sanctions. First, by issuing a general licence to support transaction for humanitarian activities in Syria. And last week, we also revoked the asset freeze of 24 entities, including the Central Bank of Syria, which had been imposed to prevent Assad from using financial assets in conducting his vile oppression. Mr. Speaker, we keep all our sanctions regimes under close review. We target them on those who bear responsibility for repression and human rights abuses. It is also important that we take steps that support the economic development that Syria's people desperately need. The humanitarian situation in Syria remains dire for millions of people. Over 16 million people are currently in need of humanitarian assistance. We will continue to support those in need across Syria where it is safe to do so. Through NGO and UN organisations, we're providing food, healthcare, protection and other life-saving assistance, in addition to agriculture, livelihoods and education programmes. Since December, the UK has announced over £62 million in additional humanitarian assistance to support vulnerable Syrians inside Syria and across the region. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, this is a critical, fragile moment for Syria. The country faces significant challenges as it transitions after almost 14 years of conflict. Stability in Syria is firmly in our interests. The UK remains committed to the people of Syria, and will continue to stand with them in building a more stable, free and prosperous future. I commend the statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Minister for advance sight of his statement. This is the first statement on Syria offered by the government this year, and frankly, it could not have come soon enough. It is deeply alarming that in recent days we have borne witness to some of the deadliest violence in Syria since the beginning of this dreadful conflict. This side has been raising questions, written and oral, about the government's approach to Syria throughout the year. So it is with some disappointment that we've had to wait this long and, to be quite frank, for these events, for a minister to give an update. Reports that hundreds of civilians have been killed in clashes, including Alawite civilians, is troubling. The Syrian people have suffered 14 years of conflict and decades of oppression. The country is now at a fork in the road, but these terrible events are a stark reminder that a better future for the people of Syria, for all groups and all minorities, is far from guaranteed. We should be very clear that those who have ratcheted up the appalling situation in recent days should pull back from the brink and not jeopardise that better future. Mr. Speaker, the Labour government has decided to establish contact with HTF and interim administrations in Syria. So can the Minister confirm whether the Foreign Office has raised this escalation in violence with interlocutors? And if so, whether the government has clearly conveyed a set of expectation for how the temperature should be taken down and stability restored? Can the Minister also confirm whether there has been any direct engagement between ministers and HTS leaders at any point? And what is his assessment of both HTS's response to this violence and the threat posed by the remnants of the disgraceful Assad regime? We note the government has announced that it's lifting 24 sanctions on entities linked to the supposed Assad regime. Does the violence of recent days change the government's assessment of the merits of lifting these kinds of sanctions? And before he lifted those particular sanctions, did he consult with the US and European allies as well as partners in the region? Were the sanctions lifted at the request of HTS, and are there plans to lift further sanctions? And can the Minister also be clear with the House about precisely what conditions, criteria and evidence is being used to drive these decisions? On the Minister's recent visit to Turkey last week, the Minister said that the UK is committed to working in partnership with Turkey to support Syria's transition to an inclusive and peaceful country. But what exactly does that mean in practice, and what does he see as Turkey's role moving forward? On security issues specifically, can he confirm there remains no change to the Conservative government's very firm position on foreign fighters, that they must not come back to the UK? What is his assessment of the Syrian state's ability to counter any ISIS cells in the east of the country? And on securing borders in the region and the prevention of people smuggling, drugs and weapons, has he seen any progress? The government is right that we need to see Assad's chemical weapons stockpiles secured and destroyed, and this needs to be verified by the Organisation for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But is the Minister confident that these weapons will indeed be destroyed? We acknowledge the government has put more funding towards the OPCW Syria missions following the fall of Assad's regime, but we still need Syria to meet its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention in full. We need to see concrete actions as well as words. Now, turning to the humanitarian situation, where does he judge the need is most acute? And how is he mobilising the UK aid situation to ensure that it's being safely distributed and genuinely reaching those innocent civilians in need? And with the reduction of ODA to 0.3%, can the Minister confirm if Syria will continue to be a priority and that funds will be made available given the security and strategic issues? And finally, on the transition to representative and inclusive governance, we note the launching of the non-binding National Dialogue Conference by the interim government of Syria. Does the Minister believe that this process will yield the kind of results that we all want to see for the people of Syria? And has he discussed this through the channels he has established with the interim government?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try and take as many of those questions as I can. As I think the Shadow Foreign Secretary will know, we have had contact at a senior level with the new HTS leadership. That includes their interim Foreign Minister, who our Foreign Secretary met on the margins of the Paris meeting. We have not sent ministers to Damascus yet, as many of our partners will do. We keep these issues under close review. On the question of whether or not we're consulting with Europeans on sanctions and other things, the Europeans have taken steps on sanctions slightly in advance of us, so I can't remember the precise date, but they have put their relaxation of sanctions in before we have. I can confirm to the Shadow Foreign Secretary that we keep all of the decisions under sanctions under very close review. The 24 entities where the lift on sanctions came into place on Friday are very much focused on the economic function of Syria. As the Shadow Foreign Secretary will know well, Syria is in the midst of a very significant economic crisis. The Syrian pound has lost 99% of its value. We want to protect the Syrian people from the consequences of that crisis, and so the relaxation of the sanctions is very much focused on allowing normal Syrians and the humanitarian actors to get on with their lives, but we will keep all further sanctions under close review. She asks about HTS's progress on borders, countering terrorism, drugs. She's exactly right, Mr. Speaker, to say we must judge HTS on their actions, not their words. There has been some very welcome commitments from HTS on a range of questions. To refer to her points about OPCW, we have seen welcome commitments from the new interim authorities to work with OPCW. Their interim foreign minister has, in a very welcome way, engaged with the OPCW authorities who have now visited Damascus. That is to be welcomed, but the Shadow Foreign Secretary is right. Actions, not words, will be how we judge our Syria policy.
Chair of the committee, Dame Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I thank the Minister for his statement today and echo his horror at the killing of civilians in Syria this weekend. And I agree with the Minister that this is a critical and fragile moment for the country. Mr. Speaker, in a letter to me last week, the Foreign Secretary made clear the government's policy is to push for an inclusive political process and accountability in Syria. This is, of course, exactly what is needed to deal with the tensions that have been formed by decades of civil war and a brutal dictatorship. But the question is, what's the government actually doing to make sure that this happens? We hear about aid and the loosening of sanctions. Is this the full extent of the plan? Or if there is more, can it be implemented properly so long as we don't have an embassy in Syria and when our special representative has only visited Damascus twice this year?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend raises very important points about transitional government and asks me what it would look like. What it would look like is for all of Syria's diverse communities to feel that they have a presence in the new government in Syria. There are, of course, many Alawites, many Druze, many Kurds, many Christians across Syria feeling very, very nervous at the moment. And we call on the interim administration to do all that they can to reassure communities through actions, not words, that they are welcome in the new Syria. And I was discussing this, as the Shadow Foreign Secretary noted, with my Turkish counterparts last week. I can confirm that we have delivered these messages clearly and consistently to the interim authorities, that we have addressed the most recent violence with them, and we are seeking urgent clarification on the confusing events at the coast, which are, as my right honourable friend says, absolutely horrifying. On the questions of a future British presence in Syria, I will return to this House when I'm in a position to give a follow update.
Monica Harding, the Liberal Democrat spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Reports from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights that at least 1,000 Alawites have been killed over the past few days are deeply concerning. This escalation in violence undermines Syria's fragile transition away from dictatorial rule under Assad and harms efforts to encourage religious and sectarian tolerance. At this stage, it's critical we understand whether the violence represents spontaneous clashes between different sects or is the product of state-directed policy. This must inform the government's position on whether to lift sanctions to support Syria's development and reintegration into the global community. I note that the interim Syrian government has announced the establishment of an independent committee to investigate the violent clashes, but this must also be followed up by concrete steps to protect Syrians of all ethnic and religious groups, ensure they are represented in the new administration, and take action to bring justice to those who have perpetrated violence in this conflict. The international community must also work with partners in the region to support Syria's transition away from dictatorial rule, including by emphasising the importance of embedding religious and sectarian tolerance, as well as the rights of women in the new Syrian regime. Please could the Minister update the House on what he is doing to engage with partners in the region, including the Syrian government, to promote respect and support for religious and sectarian tolerance within Syria. It's important too that this government recognises the role that neighbouring countries like Jordan and Lebanon are taking to generously welcoming Syrian refugees, but are now facing immense challenges in providing food, shelter and essential services. Can the Minister outline how the cut to international aid will impact our ability to support Syria's economic development, including bilateral aid to neighbouring countries like Jordan and Lebanon, where many Syrians have sought refuge?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal Democrat spokesperson poses many of the most vital questions. Of course, we need to very carefully determine the nature of this violence on the coast in order to make a full assessment of the most appropriate response. We have raised with all of Syria's neighbours, we consult with them closely, Jordan, Turkey, many others, the importance of Syria making this transition, which is vital for Syrians, vital for the region, and vital for some of the global issues that the Shadow Foreign Secretary has outlined, whether those are counter-terrorism questions or drug supply. In relation to the questions on aid, I can confirm we will continue to play our full part in Syria. There will be an international pledging conference on Syria in Brussels on Monday, and I expect we'll be able to make further announcements in advance of that.
Blair back to.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The interim government in Syria has suggested that the operations were complete in the coastal areas and that things had now calmed down, but human rights groups are suggesting that the violence is ongoing. I wonder what the government's assessment is over whether this was a spike in violence or whether this is a continuing escalation in the security situation in Syria.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend rightly points to some of the confusion around events at the coast. We are monitoring very closely. We will update once we have more clarity, but we are calling on the interim authorities to ensure that this violence stops now.
Member of the House, Edward Leigh.
The Christian community in Syria is one of the oldest in the world. It was about 10% of the population up to the civil war, now down to 2%. Aid the Church in Need has described Friday as a black and painful day for Christians in the Latakia area, with Christians being murdered in their cars and in their homes. Will the Minister, representing as he does a Christian country, call out the new Sunni Muslim government of Syria and say they have an absolute duty of care to all minorities, Christians, Druze, Alawite or others?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I say to the right honourable member, my neighbour, that of course we do call on the interim administration to ensure the full representation of every one of the minorities in Syria: the Christians, the Druze, the Kurds, the Alawites, and many others.
Patel.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his statement and for the support that the government is giving to the people of Syria. After the terrible events of this weekend, it just brings home the vital importance of having an inclusive process going forward for all people in Syria. I'm aware of the Minister's response to the previous question about our diplomatic presence in Syria, but is the government looking at ways in which we can increase our engagement with civil society within Syria as well? Because it's not just the administration that it's important that there is engagement with, but actual civil society. There's a number of peaceful initiatives that they want to do to build a more inclusive society, but they're struggling to get government and non-governmental funding into that, and it's struggling to have the right conversations. So is that something the UK government could look at as we build a more peaceful and inclusive society in Syria?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend has worked on these issues for many years. He's right about the vital role of civil society. I was pleased to meet Syrian civil society with him and indeed separately, and I'm pleased to confirm to the House that we have been talking to a range of different Syrians in Syria, including Alawites, after the events of the weekend.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Minister is to be commended for bringing this statement before the House today. He will be aware that Britain has been very heavily involved since the time we helped set up the Za'atari camp in supporting the 5 million people in surrounding countries who we know would wish to go home as soon as the situation allows. My plea to him today is to ensure that with all the other preoccupying crises that are going on around the world, the full force of the Foreign Office, with its long history of engagement in Syria, does not get distracted elsewhere, but is brought to bear at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I pay tribute to the work of the Right Honourable Member for his many years of work on Syria as the Secretary of State for DFID and in many other capacities. And I can confirm that I and we will remain focused on events in Syria. They are of vital importance to the region, they are of vital importance to the UK, and we will continue to give them the focus that they deserve.
James Naish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wholeheartedly welcome the UK Government's efforts to support the Syrian people in their country's fragile path to building its democracy following the overthrow of the brutal Assad regime. But given the rapidly evolving situation, can I ask if the Government is considering further boosting its foreign aid support and spend in Syria during this particularly fragile period?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said in the statement, we have provided £62 million since the fall of Assad, and we will keep these questions under review. There's a pledging conference on Monday where we'll be talking to our partners. Not all the aid, as my honourable friend will know, will come from the UK, of course, and coordination with our partners is a vital component of this, but I expect to be able to say more in the coming days.
Brian Mathew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a Syrian family living in my constituency. The wife is from a small village in Tartus, and her husband is from Salamayeh, a town in Hemel. Both of their families are still there. They are both part of a religious minority, the Ismaili community, and come from a very diverse area with Alawite, Muslim and Christian villages. The mountainous areas around Tartus are currently being ravaged by extremist Muslim groups, killing whole families. The area near her husband's family is preparing for an imminent attack. My constituents are terrified for the safety of their family. They're pleading for an urgent intervention from the international community to stop the killings and protect civilians. Thank you.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for the moving account. The family in his constituency is representative of Syria, which is a place of many different minorities and communities with a long history of working together. I can confirm I'm working with international partners, including the United Nations, to do everything that we can to ensure that the violence on the coast stops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister paints an extremely concerning picture about what is happening in Syria at this present time. On the 9th of December, the government announced a temporary pause in accepting asylum applications from those from Syria because of our hopes for the future of the country. Can you tell us what conversations he's had in the light of what he's telling us now with his colleagues in government about what should inform that assessment moving forward and what that means for those here in our country?
Mr. Speaker, events over the weekend are still unfolding. I'm not really in a position to provide any further commentary on what it might mean in relation to other parts of government, but we'll return to this House when I do.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Russia has obviously previously been significantly involved in Syria. As part of his investigations and overview of what has happened, will he look specifically at whether Russia played any role in these events, particularly through social media?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will.
Tulip Siddy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his statement and echo his sentiments and worries about the escalating violence in the region. He will be aware of the chronic underfunding of health facilities in the region, in particular maternity services and newborn care facilities. There are worrying reports about pregnant women losing their lives as they're shuffled between hospitals because of inadequate medical supplies. So could I ask him, what conversations is he having with the interim government about the health provision in the region, but in particular women's health provision?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have had some initial conversations with the interim administration about some of the more practical questions around social services, and I'm happy to write to the honourable member with my honourable friend with further details about those discussions.
No harm.
Thank you,
Mr Speaker. The Foreign Secretary is on record as saying that an inclusive political process, one which protects Syria's religious and ethnic minorities, was his top priority. But we know that these attacks on civilian and minority groups have never ceased and were becoming increasingly frequent before this recent atrocity. So could the Minister tell us, how is that strategy of protecting religious and ethnic minorities being implemented on the ground? And what protective measures have been put in place in these past 3 months to defend those minority groups from further violent attacks? And how is it being assessed and monitored so that prevention can be put in place before they happen again?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I think it's important at this note to highlight that the violence that we have seen over the weekend is not what we have seen since the fall of Assad. This is a particularly acute spike of violence. So the honourable member is right to say that we must do everything that we can to prevent the kind of violence that we have seen over the weekend. We need to do everything that we can to understand the causes of it, the perpetrators of it, and whether or not, as my honourable friend was asking, it has indeed fully ceased. When I'm in a position to make that assessment, I'm happy to return to the House.
That was terrible.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister has mentioned about the attacks on Alawites and other minority communities where we've seen civilians attacked, killed and injured. But can the Minister tell me, will he condemn the attacks and what support would he give to those minority communities who feel incredibly under threat at this present time?
Minister.
I will condemn the attacks. It is absolutely disastrous for the future of Syria and indeed its people if violence spreads on a sectarian basis between communities in Syria. It is in everybody's interests, in Syrian, in British, in regional interests, that Syria is now stable and has a chance to recover after all of these years of Assad's oppression. So I do condemn them. I condemn them both because they're egregious human rights violations, and I condemn them because they threaten the future of Syria.
Sir Luke Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Congratulate the Minister, especially on his last answer. Unfortunately, world events and crises have an unfortunate not going consecutively, and obviously we've got the issues in Ukraine, but I understand the Prime Minister this weekend is once again looking at a coalition of will in Ukraine. But can we make sure that the vacuum that may be filled in parts of Syria doesn't get filled with third-party actors who do not have our interests at heart or those of Europe? So can I urge him to speak to his right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, about how perhaps we can play a role in making sure that we don't allow that to happen for the security of the continent?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. As my other colleague said, clearly there have been malign third-party actors in Syria for some time. Russia and Iran have played a deeply malign role in Syria in all of these years of the Assad regime. We are glad that their influence is reduced, and we will do all that we can to ensure that Syrians can stand on their own feet without third-party influence, and that there is a stable and inclusive government which can take the next steps for Syria. That is a challenge for all the reasons that we're discussing.
David Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Given the horrifying events as we've been hearing over the weekend in Syria, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the time for warm words from the Syrian government on protecting minorities has now passed, and that it's actions to safeguard the religious minorities such as Alawites and Christians that are required now? And if so, what more can the United Kingdom actually do to prompt those actions?
Minister.
My honourable friend is right. Actions, not words, must be the yardstick by which we judge the interim authorities. They have, including the interim president, made some important commitments following the violence about holding the perpetrators to justice, about being clear that this is not state-ordered, and we need to now see the consequence of those words in those coastal communities in Syria, and we'll be watching very carefully.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Foreign Secretary wrote to the Foreign Affairs Committee last week about the importance of ensuring accountability for crimes committed under the Assad regime. Today's government statement, in the wake of the violence that we saw over the weekend, instead calls on the interim authorities in Syria to set out a path to transitional justice. Has the UK's position on accountability for war crimes under Assad changed in the wake of the sectarian violence that we've seen over the weekend?
Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, it has not. We announced a further £240,000 to ensure that vital evidence in relation to the Assad regime can be secured and preserved in order that there can be accountability. Our attitude towards the Assad regime has not shifted in light of the events over the week.
Alexa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're obviously all aghast at the terrible violence and deaths in the western coastal region of Syria to minority communities. But for the last few weeks, we've also seen attacks on Tishreen Dam and neighbouring areas by Turkish forces, including bombing of areas which include civilians. What discussions has the Minister had with our Turkish NATO allies in terms of ceasing the violence in northern Syria, particularly considering the PKK over the border in Turkey has declared a ceasefire?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I discussed these issues with my Turkish counterpart in Ankara last week. It is a shared position of the British and Turkish governments that what we want to see in northern Syria is a peaceful resolution to the tensions there, leading to a government which is inclusive, including all of the communities, and it is clearly welcome the developments in Turkey, including the statement from Mr. Öcalan that the PKK will lay down their arms, and we do not want to see Turkey threatened by foreign terrorist fighters from anywhere, including Syria, but it is also vital, as my honourable friend says, that violence in northern Syria stops.
Sir Julian Willis.
The collapse of Assad was always going to be a setback for Russia, but it was also always going to be a boost for the Islamist opposition. Even if there's only a 5% chance of forming an inclusive, democratic, stable Syria, then the government is clearly right to try and promote that. But it should recognise also that the real threats to us are chemical weapons falling into Islamist hands and the Syrian democratic forces no longer being able to keep those Islamists who are currently confined in camps under control. What happens when they get released?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is right about the vital importance of the chemical weapons programme in Syria being safely destroyed, and I'm glad that there has been some progress made in that regard. We've increased our funding and cooperation with the OPCW and have been encouraging of those efforts in Syria to start the safe and full destruction of the chemical weapons programme. We also remain very clear-eyed about the threats, the continuing threats from ISIS in north and east Syria, and we are very conscious, as the Shadow Foreign Secretary raised, of the risk from those camps, and we remain closely engaged with all of our partners on those questions.
Chris Vance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his ongoing leadership in this issue, and I think we would all agree that our hearts go out to the victims of the terrible attacks and their families. Does the Minister agree with me that when we talk about a pathway to a stable and inclusive Syria, it's important that us and our allies all speak with one voice?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I do. We have been engaged closely with our partners. We have travelled extensively to the region. It is vital that the international community, both in the region and beyond it, speak with one voice in order to give the best possible chance for the inclusive government that we all want to see in Syria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his statement and share his deep concern about the violence over the weekend. The Minister mentioned the over 16 million Syrians in need of humanitarian assistance, mentioned the pledging conference next week, but can I ask the Minister to explain how the UK can support a safe, secure, sustainable transition in Syria, given the devastating cuts to UK aid recently announced, and what his assessment is of the security implications of those cuts in Syria and more broadly?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to sound too unduly cheery given the stage of economic crisis that Syria is in, but in many respects access into Syria for humanitarian aid has got easier since the fall of Assad, and so our aid programmes are able to make a difference. We have 62 million, is not a small number, and it's making a real difference to saving lives. We will be able to say a little bit more about how much further we can go on providing aid into the future at the Brussels conference, where it is going to be really important that we talk with our partners too.
Dr. Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The transitional government has obliquely referred to what it calls foreign parties in the coastal regions of Syria. But given Iran and Russia's long-standing alliance with Assad and the Alawites, it's not difficult to understand who is being referred to. Given current uncertainty, will the government be very circumspect about who it shares intelligence and information and data with regarding the region, given where it may well end up?
Yeah, very good.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I won't comment unduly on intelligence matters in this chamber, but as I said to one of the other honourable gentlemen across the other side, we will be looking very carefully at the involvement of third parties in Syria in recent days.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Syria has in the past and will continue to be an incubator of terrorist threats, not just to the region but more widely. What work is the government doing to work with allies to contain that threat and degrade that threat?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the terrorist threat that emerges from Syria is very high on the agenda of this government. We have been talking with our partners in the region, with our American colleagues and many others about what we can do to ensure that in this period of transition and uncertainty, ISIS is not able to take advantage.
Jeremy Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I thank the Minister for coming to the House and making what is a very important statement today? Is he able to make any comment on the continuing presence of foreign troops in Syria, Russian, Turkish, American and Israeli forces that are presently occupying at least the demilitarised zone just beyond the Golan Heights, and what pressure is being put for the withdrawal of those forces and a cessation of their military activities within Syria to give an opportunity for Syria to come to a conclusion to this appalling period, hopefully with peace and justice in the future?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there are clear, as the right honourable gentleman alludes to, and he's knowledgeable on these issues, there are a range of different military forces in Syria under different auspices. It is for when there is a new full Syrian government, it will be for them to decide which forces should be in their country. Let me be clear about the British position. We have been of the view for a long time that the Russian and Iranian presence is malign. It will be for the new authorities to work out whether or not they are prepared to accept a continued Russian presence, given all of the damage that that Russian presence has done to the Syrians. And in relation to the Israeli presence in the country to which he alludes, we have got assurances from the Israelis that that presence will be temporary, and we expect them to stick to that.
Mr. Speaker, like the Minister, I was appalled by the events in Syria this weekend. The killings show that the international community needs to be more involved in Syria. Please will the government consider pushing for a United Nations assistance mission to support a transition government so that all Syrians can be protected? Thank you.
I have been in contact, Mr. Speaker, with Geir Pedersen, who is the senior UN envoy in Syria. There are ongoing discussions about what further support the United Nations might be able to provide to Syria, and we'll keep this House updated as they develop.
Mr. Speaker, on the 11th of December, the Home Secretary gave a statement to the House on border security and collaboration following the Cali group, and that was just after the collapse of the Assad regime. I made the point in that statement that there needed to be, it was critical that there were safe routes to asylum for those who were the most vulnerable. And the events of the past few days illustrate exactly why that needs to be the case. Are there safe routes to asylum for people? And if there are not, will the Minister undertake to raising that directly with his colleagues in the Home Department?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I said in answer to the previous question from my honourable friend, we will make a close assessment of the developments in the coastal areas, but at the moment this violence appears to be isolated to that area, but we will keep it under close review.
Jim Shelton.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I looked to my right. Okay. Can I thank the Minister very much for the statement. As Chair of the APP, All-Party Parliamentary Group for Freedom of Religious Belief, I need to express concern regarding the slaughter of Christians, Druze and Alawites in Syria. Before the civil war in 2011, Syria was home to approximately 1.5 million Christians. By 2022, this number had tragically dwindled to around 300,000, and today there's even less. Under this new regime, the number has fallen further. Given these horrifying developments, can I ask whether the Minister will review the planned £50 million aid prepared for Syria in light of the refusal of the interim Syrian government to address the ethnic cleansing of Christians, and how government can ensure that aid is delivered on the ground through reputable charitable groups rather than those turning a blind eye to the Christian persecution?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, we condemn any sectarian attacks, any actions to stoke intercommunal tensions within Syria. Syria has long benefited from its many minorities and its great diversity, and that is what we want to see in the future of Syria. We have given £62 million since the fall of Assad. We monitor that closely to ensure that it goes, as the Honourable Gentleman says, through reliable channels with proper controls to ensure that there is no misuse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An Arab proverb goes that better 100 days of tyranny than one day of anarchy. And we saw the result of the anarchy over the weekend, with potentially over 1,500 civilians killed. So can I ask the Minister, would the government support a well-resourced, integrated United Nations group with a beefed-up mandate and a new and potentially a new Syrian envoy familiar with the country and one who speaks Arabic to help resolve the issue there?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I said in response to the previous question, we are in discussions about what a UN role could be in a future Syria. I won't comment too much on what personnel might staff it.
Was the delisting of 24 institutions from sanctions on Friday the product of engagement with the interim government? And if so, in light of the gruesome mass murders of Saturday, was that decision premature?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is true that the interim administration are asking for sanctions relaxation, but I just want to draw the House's attention to the economic situation in Syria. 99% of the value of the Syrian pound has disappeared. 90% of the population are living below the poverty line. This is an acute emergency, and we want to see, now Assad is gone, Syria as a stable country which can stand on its own 2 feet. Those 24 bodies are involved in the basic function of Syria's economy. We will keep all of our sanctions under review, as you would expect, and once we have a clearer picture of events over the weekend, I will return to the House.